Hello and welcome to the annual meeting's 2021 Climate Seminar, Countdown to COP26. The COP26 Climate Conference starts in less than 3 weeks, so we are very fortunate to be joined today by the president of COP26, Mr. Alok Sharma, who has taken time out of his incredibly busy schedule to join us. Welcome, Alok. And let me say a couple of words to introduce you. You have a fantastic career. Before becoming president of the COP, you were UK Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, very relevant. Secretary of State for International Development, very relevant. And Minister of State for Employment at the Department of Work and Pensions, also very relevant. And since you started in the President for COP26 role in January, you have been relentless in leading the preparation for this critically important for the future of the World Summit. And you also chaired UK's Climate Action Implementation Cabinet Committee that coordinates government action towards net zero by 2050. Very, very happy to have us with us today. And let me go straight to my first question, Alok. Welcome.
Well, Kristalina, thank you so much. It's an absolute delight to be here. And you and I have had very many discussions over the past year. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. So let's start with the basics. Can you tell the audience what does COP means and why it matters so much? What needs to happen at COP next month?
Well, you'll have a very informed audience, but if they'll forgive me, I'll just explain that. I mean, COP stands for Conference of the Parties. The parties are the just under 200 countries in the world that come together every year under the UN auspices to talk about climate action and set out commitments to tackle this. And the summit that we're going to have in Glasgow will be the 26th COP. And the last big one was in Paris in 2015, and so Glasgow is the next sort of big milestone, and it's in what I think we all regard as a decisive decade. So why does it matter? What are we trying to achieve out of COP? Well, simply put, it's world leaders coming together to make commitments on tackling climate change and limit global warming. Why does that matter? There was a report that came out from the IPCC a few weeks ago, which said that we are now at 1.1 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And for very many people, that doesn't sound like very much. But unfortunately, the impact of 1.1 degree is felt around the world. It is devastating lives and livelihoods. I've been to countries around the world. I've been to Barbuda, which was hit by a hurricane a few years ago, devastated the island, and they haven't fully recovered yet. You're seeing, for instance, Madagascar, the first climate-induced famine in the world, no rain for 4 years, and the scientists say that this is due to climate change. And the IPCC was very clear that it is human activity that is causing the climate change that we face. And in Paris, the world agreed that we would play our part in ensuring that global temperatures were limited to well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts aiming for 1.5 degrees. And frankly, every fraction of a degree makes a difference. And that's why we need to come together at COP and find the solutions and make the commitments to ensure that we are limiting global warming and we're keeping the rise in temperatures to within the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I've been, as you say, going around the world. I've been to 34 countries, some of them twice over the past 8-9 months. I've talked to well over 100 governments, leader level, at ministers, at the chief negotiator level. And there have been 4 consistent asks that I've had. First is that every country steps forward with ambitious plans to cut emissions and set out plans to go to net zero in their economy by the middle of the century. Secondly, for the developed nations to step up and provide that $100 billion a year finance that was promised to developing countries. Thirdly, for countries to set out plans on how they adapt to the climate change that's already happening. And finally, for countries to come together and agree the final outstanding rules of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was a framework agreement. Some of the detailed rules were left for future, and we need to get those right now so that we can operationalize the Paris Agreement. And we've been seeing some progress. So when we took on the COP26 presidency, less than 30% of the world was covered by a net zero target. We're now at over 70%, more countries stepping forward in the last few days. We had some good announcement at the UN General Assembly. The reality is we are not there yet. And that's why over the coming weeks, we need particularly the biggest economies, the G20, to step forward with more ambition.
Well, thank you very much, Alok, and that resonates very much with us at the IMF. We actually are so much engaged now to integrate climate considerations in our own work. Why? Because it matters for growth and prosperity over time, and when countries are hit by a climate shock, it matters to people and their economies right now. We take climate as a defining factor in the way we approach our policy engagement with countries, the way we think about building capacity in finance authorities, the way we think about macroeconomic data, and how we can be a factor in what you're talking about, a massive transformation of our economies to low carbon and climate resilient future. Very often people ask me, why would climate be of any relevance to the International Monetary Fund? And the answer is very simple. Because how we address climate change matters in reducing risks to people and economies, but it also matters because it creates opportunities for green growth and green jobs. In other words, it is at the heart of the work of the IMF, which is about growth, employment, and financial and macroeconomic stability. I'm very interested to hear from you as COP president when you discuss climate change with leaders from a very wide range of countries, especially from developing countries vulnerable to climate shocks, coastal communities. What messages do you hear from those leaders that are relevant for us at the IMF, that are relevant for how economic policy is being structured and positioned for the future?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I think, Kristalina, that was a great explanation of why climate matters in the work of the IMF. I think there are lots of people out there, who think of the IMF as being focused on issues like inflation, like public debt. And so I think it's great that, you have this focus and a really great explanation as to why it's so important for the IMF that climate action is something that takes place. In terms of the messages I'm getting from developing countries, the climate vulnerable countries, is that the world has to recognize that they are on the front line of climate change, and actually, these are countries that weren't ultimately responsible for creating the climate change that they are facing themselves, and they have two big asks. One is the ask from all countries, but particularly the biggest emitters, those G20 nations, to step forward with ambition to cut emissions. And the second is the issue on finance. And one of the things that I certainly feel very much is that climate change is, I believe, the biggest security risk that the world faces. And you see this very acutely around the world. So whether it is an issue of scarcity of water, whether it is issue of food and the impact of droughts, of locusts, for instance, in parts of Africa, whether it's an issue of forced migration, or indeed health impacts. I do think there are lots of countries that believe that this is the number one issue that we need to address. So I think in terms of the issue on finance, of course, delivering on this 100 billion is absolutely critical. And I've been working very hard on that issue over the past months. We're going to be setting out a delivery plan ahead of COP26, working with our friends in the German and Canadian government, and we've had some good news. The US President Biden put forward a doubling of their climate finance commitment at the UN General Assembly. We've had more money this year put forward by Japan, by Canada, by Germany, which is all great news, but actually we need all of the developed nations to step up and support this particular effort. And when it comes to finance, I think the other issue that developing countries raise is about access to finance. So what they will say is that, yes, big numbers are put out there, but actually their concern is getting access to the finance. And so, you and your team very kindly joined us at the Climate and Development Ministerial meeting we held back in March. And the result of that is a task force the UK has set up together with Fiji. And we're going to pilot in 5 countries some projects to ensure that we can see how we can get better access to finance. The final issue is obviously developing countries want to see more finance going to adaptation. So I would say 2 big asks. One is on finance and the other is on mitigation. And that means the G20, all of them, stepping up with plans to cut emissions ahead of COP26.
Thank you. And that actually is very important input for us at the IMF. On the first issue of access to finance, as you know, our membership has decided to put forward the largest allocation of special drawing rights, $650 billion equivalent, to help countries underpin the recovery from the pandemic-induced crisis. But as we do so, the membership is also ready to experiment with on-lending some of the SDRs from countries with strong positions that don't really need it for their reserves, to go to countries that are in desperate need of financing so they can cope with the pandemic, but also underpin this transformation to low carbon and climate resilient future. And I'm very pleased that during the annual meetings this year, we will be discussing the creation of a new resilience and sustainability trust to be funded by on-lending of SDRs exactly for that objective, to allow countries to change their economies to low carbon performance, and especially for vulnerable countries to build resilience to climate shocks in the future. On the issue of financing, we are also helping countries to be more explicit about their integration of climate indicators in macroeconomic indicators. We have a big initiative on data, so investors can see how their climate plans translate into the right policies. And in that regard, we are emphasizing on 4 actions. 1, pricing carbon. Unless we price carbon and move that price up from $3 a ton, where it is today, to around $75 a ton by 2030, we are not signaling to businesses and to consumers that a low carbon future is a must. Second, to get more fiscal space and more investment in this green transformation, in low carbon, climate resilient infrastructure, urban development. You talked about water management. So we can give an impulse for the transformation through this action. 3, to be sure that we recognize there are vulnerable communities and, of course, vulnerable countries. They need help for this transition, and that has to be done in a way that is fair. And 4, and that is the point you make, prioritize adaptation in countries that contribute very little to climate change, but suffer tremendously its consequences. So we embrace all this in our so-called Article 4, in our policy engagements with countries, in our capacity development, and very important in our financial sector work, where we help these risks to shocks, to transition, to be explicitly visible for investors, and on that basis shift the direction of investment to where it has to go. Alok, I was very impressed to see that climate-related investments are going up and up and up. They jumped by 50% over the last year. But they're still tiny overall. You know, they're like 1/4% of the total investment flows today. That has to change, and we want to send the signals for this change to happen. And actually, that takes me straight to my next question to you. If you were to get your wish come true in the participation of international institutions like the IMF, like the multilateral development banks at COP26, what do you want from us? What are our marching orders?
Well, firstly, I want to thank you, Kristalina, because you have been a real sort of climate champion and driving the SDR issues. And you know, I mean, it's great that the discussion on reallocation and looking at different trust funds is going to take place at your annual meeting. And I hope there will be conclusions on that, because there are developing nations that talk about, you know, how little was reallocated last time there were SDRs issues. And you know, G7, of course, set out some months ago their thoughts on the fact that, you know, there needs to be a good portion of reallocation coming out of the $650 billion. So, and you're absolutely right. I think that the countries will, the developing nations and the vulnerable countries will want to see this reallocation coming and supporting them with you know, a green recovery. That's something that we all have an opportunity to do now coming out of COVID. And I think this is one of those sort of key moments, I think, in history where you can reimagine how your economy looks. And of course, to do that, countries need financial support. So I'm really grateful for all the work that you have been doing, you and your team, in driving this forward so resolutely. And as I said, I hope at your meeting you will reach some conclusions on this as well. In terms of the MDBs, look, I mean, from my perspective, you know, the work that you are doing, the World Bank more widely, the other MDBs are doing, is absolutely critical. I mean, it really is very, very critical. And I talked about the 100 billion, obviously, the finance that's allocated from the multilateral development banks will count there. So I think, you know, seeing that actually we have got MDBs increasing the proportion of their funding which is being allocated to climate projects, I think is very good news. Obviously, we've been seeing that at the World Bank as well, to see that increased financial commitment. And of course, we need to see more of it. And I think there's a very important point you've raised about that balance between adaptation and mitigation. And one of the things that developing countries will tell you is that for a very long time, adaptation has been seen as the poor cousin of mitigation. And they want that to change. And I think, you know, you very clearly understand that call, as do I. So I think what we want to see is more funding being allocated to adaptation. And then, you know, the good news is that I think just about every MDB is now committed to align its financing with the Paris Agreement by 2025, or indeed earlier. And you've got people like the EIB who are already there. So I think that is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for more commitments when it comes to the finance which is flowing to climate action. I'm looking for more focus on adaptation. And thirdly, you know, where MDBs are able to accelerate their commitment to align financing with the Paris Agreement. And I think it's worth pointing out that one of the other things that MDBs do, of course, is to leverage in private sector money as well. And this is a critical part of that 100 billion, you know, the public money, but also the mobilization that comes in from the private sector. So, you know, where MDBs are able to do more of this, you know, I very much welcome that. So absolutely, as part of the financial architecture, MDBs have a critical role to play. And there's also an opportunity, of course, to think about, you know, potential new products, which may assist in getting more private sector money in, which may help in the energy transition. You know, we are seeing lots of very good announcements that have come from countries on ending international co-financing. But how do we ensure that coal assets that are already out there and operating can perhaps be retired earlier, that can perhaps be retired in a way that aligns with a net zero world by the middle of the century. I think all of this is in play, and I know many of the MDBs are looking at these issues. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the MDBs collectively have to say at COP as well, because I know there's going to be good representation from them.
Thank you, Alok. Now we have our marching orders. For us at the fund, I take it to mean impetus for a green recovery, specificity on how our policy engagement will contribute to that. And I can tell you our objective is to engage on mitigation with the 20 largest emitters. Very pleased to say that we have already done it with the UK and a number of other countries, but also be very mindful of vulnerable countries. Give them your best policy advice on how they can adapt to what is going to be a rocky future for them. And on the financial side, I also got it to mean that the Resilience and Sustainability Trust sounds great. Make it happen. And then last but not least, work with the multilateral development banks so we together can amplify the power of our policy engagement and the impact of financing we provide. Thank you. Very clear, very useful. And yes, we will do. And I'm actually going to ask you something that I'm sure you ask yourself 3 weeks away. What is the reason for you to be hopeful this will be an impactful COP? And what makes you lose sleep? What keeps you awake at night? What are the big challenges still in front of you?
Firstly, can I say thank you for, in a brilliant summary, saying what I'm looking for is for the MDBs and the IMF to make it happen. That is precisely what we need before COP to get the funding across the line, and of course to also try and address some of these issues on debt sustainability and fiscal space as well. But you've asked me the question 3 weeks to go. What is keeping me awake at night? The one thing I can tell you, Kristalina, is that there's been a limited amount of sleep over the past year. I'm operating at fairly low hours of sleep, and that's because this is so important that we collectively deliver at COP26 for the world. What makes me hopeful is that I started in my finance career about 30 years ago, and frankly, some of your colleagues will be aware that there was a guy called Swampy. That was his nickname, and he was kind of the face of climate action in the 1990s in the UK. Swampy was someone who sort of occupied tunnels and sort of went up trees to stop development. Now, 30 years on, I would argue that the Swampies are in the boardroom. So I have been really very pleased by the fact that I think over the last few years, we are at that inflection point. In fact, we've gone past that inflection point where the corporate world, the financial services sector, is effectively singing from the same hymn sheet as governments and as civil society. They understand the challenge that we are facing in terms of climate change and why we need to take action on it. And I've been really pleased by the fact that we've had this Race to Zero campaign, the UN campaign running, where companies and non-state actors commit to go to net zero by 2050 on science-based targets, so not just some sort of vague promise. We've got thousands of big companies, multinationals who have signed up to this. We've got a grouping called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which our friend Mark Carney has been working on, for around $90 trillion of assets committed to go to net zero by 2050. The price of renewables is plummeting. We've seen over the last 10 years that the price of solar is down by around 80, 90%, the price of wind power, 60, 70%. And all of this gives me a great deal of hope. I am absolutely certain that we will see a transition to a green economy across the world in my lifetime. I'm absolutely convinced. The issue, though, is can we go fast enough so that we mitigate the worst effects of climate change? And that, Kristalina, is what we collectively need to agree on at COP26. And I would just end with one fact, because this is a decisive decade for the climate. And for a child that is born today, before that child reaches primary school age, effectively the future of this planet will be set. And that's why the world needs to come together at COP26 and seek success so that we can tackle climate change and say to future generations that we played our part when we were demanded to do so.
You put it very well. Yes, this is what gives us hope, that the tide is turning. People want this change. 70% of citizens around the world in a recent survey said, we are deeply concerned about the risks a changing climate presents to us and to our children. 80%, and this is the more important number, said we are prepared to make changes in the way we live so we can tackle this problem. The finance community is embracing sustainability and this transition to low carbon, climate resilient economy. The IMF is right there putting climate at the heart of our work. And the only question for us is, are we going to do it fast enough? Because the change needs to happen now, this year, next year, the year after. This is the critical decade, and we have the right person to lead us in this decade, Mr. Alok Sharma. Unfortunately, we run out of time, Alok. I hope we can get together after the COP and then take stock. Is what you hoped for now a reality? And are we moving towards a future in which we all have done our part in the fight against climate change? We are in this together, Alok. It has been a pleasure to discuss these issues with you. And may your every wish materialize at COP26. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristalina, and thank you for all your support, and I look forward to seeing you in Glasgow.
Yes, we will be there. Thank you. Best of luck.